Hello and welcome to Railroad Journeys Around the World. In this programme we'll be exploring the wealth of present-day railway operations in Scotland. We'll be looking at the busy main lines radiating from Glasgow and Edinburgh and the intensively worked suburban routes of Strathclyde. At the other end of the spectrum, we'll be savouring the breathtaking scenery of the Highlands, where the railway continues to provide a vital lifeline to small rural communities. We'll also be reviewing the current freight scene in Scotland, which, despite some substantial losses in the last couple of years, still includes many delightful examples of traditional railway operations. And for a taste of times past, we'll be visiting one of Scotland's most popular preserved lines, the Strathspey Railway. The East Coast Main Line is now the principal intercity route into Scotland. Almost every hour, Class 91 hauled trains provide a fast and efficient service between London, King's Cross and Edinburgh, while trains running further north to Aberdeen are worked by Intercity 125s to avoid the inconvenience of a locomotive change. In the 70s, downgrading or even closure of this stretch was being talked of, but now with the benefit of modernisation, its future seems to be secure. The main freight customer between Berwick and Edinburgh is Blue Circle Cement at Oxwell-Mains. The work produces a daily trainload of cement for View Park near Glasgow, plus regular traffic for Aberdeen. Through freight workings on the East Coast route include rover cars for distribution at Bathgate, although much of this traffic has sadly been lost to road. Coal trains run loaded in both directions. This northbound service is carrying imported coal from Redcar to Scottish Power at Longannet. One of Scotland's finest mainline stations is Edinburgh Waverley. It was first opened in 1846 as the terminus of the North British Railway from Berwick-upon-Tweed, but it was extensively rebuilt around the turn of the century. Its track layout is based on one huge island platform, with through lines on each side and with numerous bays in the middle for terminating services. The platform numbering goes up to 21, although not all those platforms are in use today. Waverley lies in a hollow in the very heart of the city. Towering above it is the palatial North British Hotel, completed in 1902 in typically florid Edwardian French Renaissance style. It's become one of the most familiar landmarks of the city. At the west end of Waverley, the railway disappears straight into the Mound Tunnel, before bisecting Princes Street Gardens in a shallow cutting. For a city centre station, it's a remarkably green setting, and it's right on the doorstep of some of Edinburgh's finest buildings. The station is overshadowed by the impressive Scott Monument. Where there used to be a splendid Baroque-style booking hall, there's now a rather more functional travel centre. But much of the station's original character has been sensitively retained, and it feels very much like a proper railway. Edinburgh has never had much of a suburban rail network. The only local service from the east side of the station runs to North Berwick. Nowadays it's worked by Class 305 electric multiple units handed down from Network South East. North Berwick trains diverge from the East Coast Main Line at Drem Junction, about 18 miles east of Edinburgh. They also provide a service to intermediate stations, such as Drem and Prestonpans. The North Berwick branch itself is only 4.5 miles long. In the 60s it was under threat of closure, but was reprieved by the Transport Minister of the day after a vigorous local campaign. Electrification was completed at modest expense as an add-on to the East Coast Main Line scheme. station looks like so many other rural branch termini in the 1990s, with its single platform and bus shelter facilities. Its original Victorian buildings were demolished in the 80s when the line was shortened by 200 metres to make way for the inevitable car park. But at least these facilities are better than none. Probably the best-known railway bridge in Britain straddles the Firth of Forth to provide a direct link between Edinburgh and the ancient Kingdom of Fife. It was built between 1882 and 1890 by a consortium of 4 railway companies: the North British, the Great Northern, the North Eastern and the Midland. It owes its unique cantilevered design and its striking proportions to an admiralty requirement that warships should be able to pass beneath it. It was the first large bridge to be constructed of steel. Only in comparatively recent times has it become possible to cross the Firth of Forth by road. The rail bridge is still unrivalled in its sheer majesty, and over a century after its completion, it still forms a vital part of the intercity network. The well-preserved station at Dalmeny is also the railhead for South Queensferry, the name reminding present-day travellers of the days when there was no fixed crossing across the Forth. Today the bridge is perhaps taken for granted by the thousands of passengers who use it each day, but it remains one of the most impressive engineering feats of the Victorian era. Another architectural gem is Stirling Station. It was rebuilt in its present form by the Caledonian Railway in 1913. Its fine, crow-stepped gables and crenellated wall heads create an imposing entrance, and the station is officially designated a Grade II listed building. The attractive exterior is matched by a spaciously welcoming and immaculately kept interior, abounding in ornate ironwork. It's a model of sensitive restoration, where up-to-date facilities have been provided without destroying the station's unique atmosphere. One feature the station is renowned for is its magnificent floral displays, adding some welcome colour to cheer up weary travellers. Stirling enjoys frequent sprinter services to Glasgow and Edinburgh, as well as long-distance links to Aberdeen and Inverness. It was also to have regained a branch service to Alloa, although that project has recently been shelved due to funding problems. Stirling's track layout and signalling have remained basically unchanged for decades. 2 manual signal boxes control an impressive array of upper quadrant semaphores, many still with their original finials. Proposals have been made in the past to put in colour lights, but a shortage of funds, as ever, has given these mechanical relics a further life extension. The trains, on the other hand, are all very much up to date, with Class 158 units offering a good standard of comfort on principal services. One of Scotland's most ambitious railway preservation projects is the Strathspey Railway, running a 5-mile line between Aviemore and Boat of Garton in the heart of the Highlands. The present terminus at Boat of Garton has a wealth of railway artefacts, with an unusually substantial station building for such a minor locality. The Strathspey Railway owns a range of mainline and industrial locomotives, including this Caledonian 060 number 828, which has recently returned to service after overhaul. The diesel fraternity is catered for by this Class 27, D5394, recently restored to BR green livery as carried when new. The The route of the Strathspey Railway originally formed part of the Highland Main Line to Inverness. Not until the direct link via Culloden was opened in the 1890s did Boat of Garton find itself on a branch line. The route was closed by BR in 1968, but the Strathspey Railway Company was quickly formed and has recently celebrated its 20th anniversary of private operation. Apart from the Strathspey Railway, there are also several other preservation sites in Scotland, including the Caledonian Railway near Montrose and the Bowness and Kinneil near Grangemouth. There are many scenic delights along BR's Highland Main Line from Perth to Inverness. Here, the majority of trains these days are worked by Class 158 units. But during the busy tourist season, Class 37s are still pushed into service with rakes of regional railways liveried hauled stock. The line is also used by excursion traffic, such as the land cruisers, which BR has successfully operated for a number of years now. This pair of 37s was still in pristine condition after recently working the Royal train. Some of the most striking scenery is between Aviemore and Inverness. Here the line includes several major engineering features, such as Slough Viaduct, and there are lengthy stretches of 1 in 60, which are still a challenge to some of today's motive power. The climb ends at Slough Summit. There used to be facilities here for banking and pilot engines, but today there's just a passing loop, controlled remotely from Aviemore signal box. The heaviest train of the day is the nightly sleeper service between London and Inverness. Haulage these days is usually a pair of intercity Class 37s. This impressive structure at Culloden consists of no less than 29 arches and sits 120 feet above the River Nairn. Inverness Station has an unusual triangular layout. Its mainline platforms curve round sharply to the east, passing the stone-built Highland Railway engine sheds which are still in use today as Inverness Diesel Depot. Surprisingly, the maintenance facilities at Inverness are extensive. The depot has an allocation of 2 Class 08s and some 30 Class 37s, some allocated to intercity and others to regional railways for engineers' trains and summertime passenger work. The depot is also host to several withdrawn Class 26s. Inverness Station frontage faces south towards the town centre. At the moment it's very conveniently situated, although there are understood to be plans to sell off the existing site and rebuild the passenger platforms further away from the town, on the present station avoiding line. One limitation of the existing station is that all the platforms are terminal, and any locomotive-hauled trains either have to back out of the station to run round, or else have an extra locomotive attached to the other end. The platforms for services to Wick and Thurso and the Kyle line curve round sharply to the west, joining up with the third side of the triangle, the station avoiding line, just beyond the platform end. Until the 1980s, these platforms were also used by some trains arriving from Glasgow and Edinburgh. They had to first run past the station and then back in. Trains leaving Inverness for the north cross the River Ness by this modern structure, completed in the spring of 1990 after the original masonry bridge had been washed away by flood debris. After leaving the Highland city behind, trains head west across lush landscapes beside the shores of the Bewley Firth, before turning northwards to reach Muir of Ord and Dingwall. Our land cruise here is heading for Thurso. Dingwall station is perhaps the best preserved of all the intermediate stations on the Far North Line. It was rebuilt in 1886 for the Highland Railway. Dingwall is the junction station for the Kyle branch, and the combination of Kyle and Far North Line services gives Dingwall 7 trains a day to and from Inverness. Dingwall's most notable feature is its fine glazed awning, supported on cast iron columns and brackets. The overall effect is pleasantly light and airy. These days the staffing at Dingwall is minimal, but it's obviously somebody's pride and joy to keep the place in shape. The footbridge is a typical Highland Railway design, and it's remarkable that even the wooden offices on the second platform are still standing and in good repair. The actual junction is about a quarter of a mile north of the station, with the track to Kyle curving off to the left. Although Inverness is often thought of as a northern outpost, the railway in fact carries on a further 161 miles to Wick on the Caithness Peninsula. A few years ago there was the possibility of shortening that distance by including a railway as part of the new Dornoch Firth Bridge. Sadly, however, funding was short and the opportunity was lost. Trains between Tain and Golspie therefore have to continue making a 40-mile detour via Legg, while the road distance via the new bridge is a mere 12 miles. One of the smaller halts, which still remarkably has its original station building, is Scots Calder. Here we're in one of the most sparsely populated areas of Scotland, and there can never have been a great deal of custom here. Georgemas is where the lines to Wick and Thurso divide. In the days of regular locomotive haulage, a loco was outstationed here for the Thurso branch, and each train with portions for both termini went through a complex shunting procedure. Nowadays, with sprinters, it's a lot easier. This most northerly station in Britain boasts a simple train shed with wooden trusses on low sandstone walls. Thurso retains its traditional track layout, although these days the loop and sidings are only occasionally called into action. Often regarded as the most spectacular setting for a railway in Britain is the line to Kyle of Loch Alch. It's hardly surprising that the trains are often filled with people just enjoying the ride, especially in the summer tourist season. These 63.5 miles of single-track railway simply offer one spectacular panorama after another, with vast mountain landscapes stretching down to tranquil lochs and sea inlets. One of the main functions of Kyle Station, and indeed of the Kyle Line, has always been to connect with the ferry to Skye, although that's all set to change now with the impending opening of the road bridge. Although the basic winter service is provided by sprinters, summer loadings force the use of loco-hauled stock. Nowadays the traction is invariably a Class 37, in this case a member of the Regional Railways infrastructure pool. Less well known is the 108-mile cross-country route from Inverness to Aberdeen. This line has also seen a major revival in the last few years. One of the principal intermediate stations is Elgin, where the old Great North of Scotland Railway buildings still survive today as offices, even though the platform behind them closed to passengers in the 1960s. Today, all Elgin's passenger traffic is concentrated on the former Highland Railway station, where facilities can best be described as basic. The most interesting aspect of present-day operations at Elgin is the 3 times weekly timber train. Although it's one of Rail Freight Distribution's contract trains for a specific customer, it carries timber from 4 separate loading points, and when it reaches Elgin it could easily be mistaken for a traditional pickup goods train. The only destination for railborne timber today is the Shotton Paper Company in North Wales, and that's where these wagons will be going once they've been loaded. The train describes a huge circuit around the north of Scotland, and at each of its calling points, Inverness, Elgin, Huntly and Inverurie, it exchanges some of its empty wagons for loaded ones. Sadly, scenes like this are certainly rare on today's streamlined railway. The next stop after Elgin is Keith. The tracks on the left used to lead into the Dufftown branch, which was closed to freight in the mid-1980s, but continued in use for excursion traffic for a few years after that. Another railway facility that's sadly no longer in use is the Shivers distillery siding. This used to forward tank loads of whisky to Dalmuir. Huntly is the next loading point for the timber train, and on this occasion it's also going to be the busiest, with about a dozen wagons due to be exchanged. The train will run forward past the goods yard and then reverse in. Timber traffic was one of the great success stories of British rail freight in the 1980s. Traffic levels rose sharply as more and more loading points and more destinations were brought into use. The traffic wasn't just from Scotland. There were also substantial carryings from South Wales, South West England and East Anglia. Unfortunately, however, most of the flows were low volume and liable to short-term fluctuations. When Speedlink came to an end in July 1991, the only flow that could be made into a viable train load was this one. There aren't many station goods yards on the BR network today that can claim to be as busy as Huntly. And with many thousands of acres of forests coming to maturity, this is traffic that ought to remain on offer for many years to come. Passenger services between Inverness and Aberdeen are mostly in the hands of Class 158 units, although the first return trip of each day is still loco-hauled. The present-day station at Aberdeen is situated on the site of one built jointly by the Caledonian and Great North of Scotland Railways in 1867. Prior to that, Inverness trains had terminated at Aberdeen Waterloo and trains from the south at Aberdeen Guild Street, the two termini being a good half-mile apart. The new joint station was then substantially reconstructed at the turn of the century, resulting in the basic layout which we still see today. The platforms are noteworthy for their ridged and glazed umbrella awnings and trussed steelwork. The station was built on a long, thin site, and at the south end it curves away sharply, joining up with the original straight-ahead route from Guild Street. Train services today are mostly operated by ScotRail, but there are still 4 intercity arrivals and departures each weekday, formed by Intercity 125 units. Most of these services run to or from London, involving nearly 400 miles of diesel operation under the wires. Apparently, however, this was considered a more cost-effective option than having a locomotive change at Edinburgh. Aberdeen Station has escaped unnecessary modernisation, and it's a very civilised starting point for a railway journey. The spacious concourse is pleasantly light and airy, while offering all modern necessities for today's intending passenger. Equally pleasing is the station frontage, with its imposing centrepiece built of cream sandstone and rich in Baroque detailing. It sits very handsomely in the heart of the granite city. The main line southwards from Aberdeen hugs the coastline most of the way to Dundee, passing through Montrose, where there's still a siding for agricultural lime traffic. South of Dundee, trains for Edinburgh and the East Coast Main Line must cross the Tay and pass by the signal box which used to mark the junction for Newport-on-Tay. The present-day Tay Bridge was completed in 1887, after the first one had collapsed 8 years previously in one of the most tragic railway accidents ever. The new bridge covers a total length of just over 2 miles, making it easily the longest railway bridge in Britain. It comprises of 74 spans, and its piers are unusually mounted on submerged iron cylinders encased in brick. Few railway journeys on BR today can rival the dramatic splendour of the West Highland Line from Glasgow to Fort William and Mallaig. The line crosses one of the most sparsely populated areas of Britain, and was certainly an act of faith on the part of the West Highland Railway Company when first opened in the 1890s. Today, despite the sparsity of the population, the route is still used by freight as well as passengers, a claim that can no longer be made by the other Highland branches to Oban, Kyle and the far north. The only centre of any significance on the line is Fort William, where the station, yard and depot are neatly gathered beneath Ben Nevis, Britain's highest mountain. The West Highland Line is familiar territory for the Royal Scotsman luxury touring train. Here it's on the final stage of its long descent from Rannoch Moor to Fort William, dropping over 1,300 feet in just 28 miles. For a town with little more than 4,000 inhabitants, Fort William is surprisingly busy with rail freight. There are still 2 booked freight services each day in both directions. Each northbound train runs overnight, and it's only in high summer that you're likely to catch one in daylight. This formation is typical of the variety that can still be seen. First there's Cirestar starch traffic from Manchester, then bulk alumina from Blythe in Northumberland, followed by clay slurry from Quidhampton near Salisbury. The yard at Fort William is used to sort traffic for the 2 main rail freight customers in the vicinity, Alcan at Fort William and Wiggins Teep at Corpac. This daily trip working operates in the early morning from the yard to Corpac. On this occasion it's carrying clay slurry and starch. Sometimes there'll also be Freightliner flats to be conveyed. It's really not very different from Speedlink days, although the range of traffics has been reduced. One of the main losses is petroleum, which now sadly goes by road. Corpac Paper Mill provides much needed local employment and also keeps freight services alive on the first few miles of the Mallaig extension. The return working of the morning Corpac to Fort William trip often carries these reels of paper, loaded on Freightliner flats for their lengthy journey to Cardiff. nearly a decade now, summertime travellers have been able to enjoy regular steam haulage on the Mallaig extension. The engine on this occasion is one that wouldn't normally have worked the line in steam days, but it's nonetheless an impressive sight as it sets out on its 41-mile journey to the tiny fishing port of Mallaig. At Banavie, the railway has to cross the Caledonian Canal, which it does by means of this massive steel bowed truss swing bridge. This stretch of railway was opened in 1901, while the canal with its unique Neptune staircase, consisting of 8 locks, had been completed nearly 80 years earlier. The Caledonian Canal provides a direct transport link between Fort William and Inverness, passing through the Great Glen and using the natural waters of Loch Ness. For the canal builders, it was an obvious route to take, and it's perhaps surprising that no through railway was ever built alongside it, only the 24-mile branch from Speenbridge to Fort Augustus. The signal box by the bridge is the radio signalling centre for the West Highland Line, as well as operating the swing bridge. Most service trains on the Mallaig extension are operated by Class 156 sprinters, offering a frequency of 4 trains a day in both summer and winter. Although it isn't quite the same as sitting behind a real locomotive, the sprinters have reduced the line's operating costs and have therefore helped to avert closure. The next stop after Banavie and Corpac is the diminutive halt of Lochiel, outward bound. As the name suggests, there isn't a great deal of habitation around here. Steam is another factor that has helped to raise the Mallaig line's fortunes. Passenger numbers have risen out of all proportion since BR started to address seriously the demands of tourism, first with observation cars in 1983 and then with the return to steam-hauled services to Mallaig a year later. Stania Black 5, number 44767, built at Crewe in 1947, was the only locomotive fitted with the outside Stephenson link motion. The line to the Isles stretches for over 40 miles, and it's certainly a journey worth savouring to the full. The Black Fives were designed as maids of all works, and many examples lasted right until the end of steam in 1968, although not in anything like this pristine condition. It was the fishing trade that first brought the railway to Mallaig. Nowadays all the fish goes by road, but the railway does still connect with the Caledonian McBrain ferries to the Inner and Outer Hebrides. Mallaig station has been much reduced in recent years. Its one-time signal box and platform awnings have long gone. Today only the original station house survives. The sharply undulating terrain made the Mallaig extension both difficult and expensive to build. Wherever possible, the line follows natural contours, but sometimes that just wasn't practicable, and as well as numerous short tunnels, there are several spectacular viaducts, of which the Glenfinnan is the best known. As with so many railway monuments, the building of Glenfinnan Viaduct was fiercely opposed, as it would irredeemably mar the beauty of the glen. Today, the concrete structure itself is admired for its simple, graceful form. The return to Fort William marks the end of the Black Five's duties for the day. The passengers on this exclusive tour will be continuing their journey south, but now with more conventional diesel haulage. Fort William Station was rebuilt and resited in the mid-1970s. The old site was commandeered by the planners and used for a new bypass road and roundabout to ease summertime congestion. The new facilities are hardly very pretty, but they are largely adequate for today's needs. After a short pause in Fort William, the Royal Scotsman embarks on the next stage of its homeward journey. For the trip to Mallaig, only the day coaches had been used, but now, in readiness for the overnight stretch, it's a return to full-length formation. Speen Bridge is a good example of the so-called Swiss chalet style of station architecture adopted by the West Highland Railway. A more modern addition is the BR Standard signal box, no longer in use for its original purpose since the line went over to radio-controlled signalling in the 1980s. The station is remarkably well maintained and is now in use as a restaurant. Bridge of Orchy is one of 7 passing loops on the 63-mile stretch between Fort William and Crianlarich. Although the current service frequency could be maintained with fewer passing loops, they do give some useful flexibility in case of late-running trains, for example, or the need to fit in special workings from time to time. Perhaps the most distinctive stretch of the West Highland Line is the famous Horseshoe Curve between Tyndrum and Bridge of Orchy, where the route to Fort William skirts the lower slopes of Ben Odar before starting the lengthy climb towards Rannoch Moor. The sheer scale of the landscape can sometimes be almost overpowering. To the south of Bridge of Orchy is the curiously cone-shaped mass of Ben Doran, rising to over 3,500 feet above sea level. Even today, the road link to Fort William is not ideally suited to heavy goods traffic. That's one reason why the railway still carries a substantial amount of freight. This particular working is a special, conveying empty Freightliner flats to Fort William and Corpac. Normally, they would have been attached to the overnight service. Beneath the desolate slopes of Ben Hisgarnish lies the village of Crianlarich. There used to be 2 stations here, this one on the West Highland Line proper and another on the Caledonian Line from Callander to Oban. Today only the West Highland Line station remains, although a short length of Caledonian metals did survive into the 1980s for the loading of timber. The rest of the link from Crianlarich to Callander, including this splendid viaduct at Glen Ogle, was closed in 1965. Like many West Highland Line stations, Crianlarich was built with a single island platform. Its main claim to fame, however, has always been its privately owned refreshment room. There used to be enough leeway in the timetable for passengers to detrain at Crianlarich and stock up on essentials before continuing their journey. Amazingly, the same opportunity exists for some passengers today, as most trains from Fort William have to wait a few minutes at Crianlarich until the connecting service from Oban arrives. The 2 sprinters will then be coupled up and complete their journey as one unit to Glasgow. After leaving Crianlarich, the train meanders down Glen Falloch, leaving the highest peaks behind it and heading now for the industrial Clyde Valley, just 30 miles ahead. The 42-mile branch line from Crianlarich to Oban descends gently along Glen Lochy as it heads out towards the coast. At Connell, this monument still survives to the long-closed Ballahoolish branch. Once a dual-purpose road and rail bridge, it's still in use today for road traffic. Oban itself is dominated by McCaig's Folly, built in the 1890s by a local philanthropist. The Folly offers a fine overall view of the town, with its railway facilities sitting proudly by the quayside. Unfortunately, the one-time timber-framed train shed and glass-roofed concourse at Oban were removed in the 1980s and replaced by this rather more functional building. Oban still has 2 terminal platforms and run-round facilities for locomotive-hauled trains, although since the demise of the line's oil traffic in 1992, these are now rarely used. Often described as Scotland's most beautiful station is Wemyss Bay. From the outside it has a definite rustic flavour, with pseudo half-timbered walls and steep gables dominated by this distinctive Italianate clock tower. Inside, the station acquires its special character from its picturesque circular booking office and its intricate fan-like roof glazing. It was completed in 1903 for the Caledonian Railway, and not surprisingly it's now classified as a listed building. Keeping it in good repair is a major headache, though. The train service is provided mainly by these Class 303 units, operating a basic half-hourly frequency to Glasgow. As well as catering for local traffic, the railway here provides a connection with ferry services from Rothesay on the Isle of Bute. Leaving behind the pleasant resort of Wemyss Bay, the railway turns east to skirt the port of Greenock and then follows the south bank of the River Clyde towards Glasgow. The Wemyss Bay line was one of several Glasgow suburban routes electrified in the 1960s. All units used on these services are now painted in the house colours of the Strathclyde Passenger Transport Executive, one of the most pro-rail of all the regional transport authorities. Not far from the Wemyss Bay branch on the main Glasgow to Ayr line, a short freight-only spur leads off to Deanside Distribution Terminal. The main traffic flow is this twice-daily trainload of palletised Spiller's pet foods from Deanside to Wisbech in East Anglia. An unusual feature of this working is that it runs loaded in both directions. On the return leg back to Scotland, it carries empty cans which have been manufactured in the Wisbech area. Another characteristic freight working in the Glasgow area is this daily oil train from Grangemouth to Bishopbriggs. It's been a regular fixture in the timetable for many years now, scheduled to depart from Grangemouth at around lunchtime. The Bishopbriggs service is the heaviest train out of Grangemouth, with a trailing load of approximately 1,600 tonnes. It used to be regularly double-headed by a pair of unrefurbished Class 37s. Nowadays, a single Class 37-7 is preferred. The terminal at Bishopbriggs is operated by Shell, but acts as a general distribution depot for many industrial and domestic customers in the Central Belt. The journey from Grangemouth to Bishopbriggs is less than 20 miles, remarkably short for a petroleum flow by rail, but still viable because of its high volume and frequency. Glasgow boasts 2 terminal stations, of which Central is the larger. The imposing Queen Anne frontage, with its pioneering steel roof, dates back to the 1870s and was clearly designed to be a showpiece of the burgeoning Caledonian Railway Company. The building abounds in elaborate and highly decorated wrought ironwork. The concourse is broad and uncluttered, which it certainly needs to be, because this is one of the busiest stations, perhaps even the busiest station in Scotland. Many traditional railway features have been retained. A varied mixture of local and long-distance services end their journey at Glasgow Central, including today Class 91 haul trains from the East Coast Main Line via Edinburgh, as well as the more traditional West Coast services. These days, the West Coast route is very much the poor relation of the East. Neither the infrastructure nor the trains have seen much advancement since the wires first went up in the 1970s, and BR has had to resign itself to losing some of its long-standing Glasgow to London traffic to the airlines. Despite the electrification, some freight workings and all engineers' trains are diesel-hauled. This rake of spoil wagons is heading for Moss End. One of the more unusual freight services is this lunchtime working from Moss End to Bescot. It's sponsored by Rail Freight Distribution and carries mainly European ferry wagon traffic. There are also some clay slurry tanks returning to Cornwall, and at the end of the train, some empty steel flats heading for Cardiff. All Scotland's Freightliner traffic is routed via the West Coast Main Line. Many workings run overnight, so catching two together in daylight like this is quite a rarity. The late 1980s saw a resurgence of open-cast mining activity in Scotland, and the railway benefited from several new flows. An entirely new loading terminal was provided here at Renstree on the West Coast Main Line near Carstairs for coal mined in the Douglas Basin. Unlike many open-cast facilities, Renstree is equipped with mechanised loading hoppers, and trains can be processed on the move, in proper merry-go-round style. When the terminal was first built, almost all the trains from it ran to Air Harbour, where the coal was exported to Ireland. Today, the Irish traffic is virtually dried up, but the terminal is still busy, thanks to new short-term contracts with the English power generators. The line from Glasgow Central to Ayr was electrified in 1986. Strathclyde liveried Class 318 units like this one provide a basic half-hourly service throughout the day. Ayr Station is dominated by the massive four-storey railway hotel, completed in 1886 and now a listed building. It has a mixture of terminal platforms for the Glasgow service and through lines which continue southwards to Girvan and Stranraer. Trains to Stranraer are normally worked by Class 156 Sprinter units. Most are through services from Glasgow, but there's also one daily working from Newcastle upon Tyne via Carlisle. Freight in southwest Scotland includes this morning train of empty steel wagons from Stranraer to Teesside. It's just called at Falkland Yard on the outskirts of Ayr for a crew change. The growth of open-cast coal traffic in the late 1980s gave two Ayrshire freight-only branches a new lease of life. This one is the 9-mile branch from Dalrymple to Chalmerston Disposal Point, near the site of the former Waterside Colliery. Loaded trains from Chalmerston run first to Falkland Yard and will then continue their journey on the other reopened freight branch to Killock Washery, where the coal is blended. The eventual destination of the coal after it's been washed varies. Some will be bound for Air Harbour, while there are also rail-borne flows to Dalry, Oakley and Blackburn. During 1993, the traction on Ayrshire coal trains was changed from pairs of 37s to single 56s, effectively halving the number of locomotives needed. The 56s are nominally allocated to Towton, but receive day-to-day maintenance at Ayr Depot. Another source of rail freight is the Caledonian paper mill at Irvine. The main rail traffic here is China clay slurry from Bungullow in Cornwall. Recently, the frequency of the slurry train with its distinctive silver bullet tank wagons has been increased from twice to 3 times weekly. The empties are scheduled to leave Irvine around tea time, but are often several hours early in practice. The only Scottish Ministry of Defence depot with a regular rail freight service to be found today is here at Eastriggs, on the Solway coast between Carlisle and Dumfries. These wagons have just been collected from the main BR Exchange sidings at Eastriggs, which is served by a daily trip working to and from Carlisle Yard. Most of the traffic is carried in these typical railway-owned VGA vans, of which the Ministry of Defence is now virtually the sole user. All goods are initially checked and transferred in this modern purpose-built, narrow and standard gauge interchange shed. Nearly all of the storage sheds where the ammunition will be eventually secured on this huge site have no road connection, and the narrow gauge railway provides their only means of access. Most trains are powered by these 4-wheel diesel hydraulics, supplied by Bagley Drury Limited in 1973. The operating gauge here is 60 centimetres, and altogether there are a total of 8 narrow gauge locos, the oldest of which dates back to 1941. The cabs on these diminutive locos can best be described as adequate for one person. As there are no fixed facilities in most of the storage areas, each train also has to carry its own unloading equipment. Loading the forklift truck onto the train is accomplished with the aid of this unusual sloping wagon, which then remains as the last unit in the formation. Eastriggs site is 8 miles across the border from Longtown, but is technically part of the same base ammunition depot. It's now unique amongst Scottish MOD depots in still being regularly served by BR. Other depots such as Giffen and Crombie lost their service when Speedlink finished in 1991, while Glen Douglas on the West Highland line is now served only occasionally by specials. The extensive depot here was initially built in 1915 to serve as a munitions factory. The factory has long since gone, but the railway survives to serve the many ammunition stores scattered around the site. For obvious safety reasons, all the stores have to be well separated, and some journey times can be quite lengthy. It only takes a few minutes to unload the forklift from the train and to start unloading the ammunition. The explosives will be stored until needed by the Army. Loco service facilities at Eastriggs are excellent, with a purpose-built shed that has facilities for both the narrow gauge and the 3 standard gauge Ruston Hornsby locos based here. There are very few places in the UK today that can offer such an interesting combination of working gauges. The railway even includes several flat crossings where both systems intersect each other. Obviously, security is extremely rigorous, and uninvited visitors are definitely not tolerated. The entire network is well hidden from prying eyes, and remarkably few people, even in the immediate area, know of this fascinating and extensive network of working narrow gauge lines. It's a pleasure to see such an unusual railway performing such an essential role. At present, there's even talk of relaying and expanding part of the system. Let's hope the outlook for the rest of Scotland's railway network will also be as bright after the impending changes for privatisation. We do hope that you've enjoyed this look at the unique railroads of this fascinating country. Bye for now. They also provide a service to intermediate stations, such as Drem and Prestonpans. The North Berwick branch itself is only 4.5 miles long. In the 60s it was under threat of closure, but was reprieved by the Transport Minister of the day after a vigorous local campaign. Electrification was completed at modest expense as an add-on to the East Coast Main Line scheme. The station looks like so many other rural branch termini in the 1990s, with its single platform and bus shelter facilities. Its original Victorian buildings were demolished in the 80s when the line was shortened by 200 metres to make way for the inevitable car park. But at least these facilities are better than none. Probably the best known railway bridge in Britain straddles the Firth of Forth to provide a direct Hello and welcome to Railroad Journeys Around the World. In this programme we'll be exploring the wealth of present-day railway operations in Scotland. We'll be looking at the busy main lines radiating from Glasgow and Edinburgh and the intensively worked suburban routes of Strathclyde. At the other end of the spectrum, we'll be savouring the breathtaking scenery of the Highlands, where the railway continues to provide a vital lifeline to small rural communities. We'll also be reviewing the current freight scene in Scotland, which, despite some although much of this traffic has sadly been lost to road. Coal trains run loaded in both directions. This northbound service is carrying imported coal from Redcar to Scottish Power at Longannet. One of Scotland's finest mainline stations is Edinburgh Waverley. It was first opened in 1846 as the terminus of the North British Railway from Berwick-upon-Tweed, but it was extensively rebuilt around the turn of the century. Its track layout is based on one huge island platform, with through lines on each side and with numerous bays in the middle for terminating services. The platform numbering goes up to 21, although not all those platforms are in use today. Waverley lies in a hollow in the very heart of the city. Towering above it is the palatial North British Hotel, completed in 1902 in typically florid Edwardian French Renaissance style. It's become one of the most familiar landmarks of the city. At the west end of Waverley, the railway disappears straight into the Mound Tunnel before bisecting Princes Street Gardens in a shallow cutting. For a city centre station, it's a remarkably green setting, and it's right on the doorstep of some of Edinburgh's finest buildings. The station is overshadowed by the impressive Scott Monument. Where there used to be a splendid Baroque-style booking hall, there's now a rather more functional travel centre. But much of the station's original character has been sensitively retained, and it feels very much like a proper railway. Edinburgh has never had much of a suburban rail network. The only local service from the east side of the station runs to North Berwick. Nowadays it's worked by Class 305 electric multiple units handed down from Network South East. North Berwick trains diverge from the East Coast Main Line at Drem Junction, about 18 miles east of Edinburgh. Substantial losses in the last couple of years still includes many delightful examples of traditional railway operations. And for a taste of times past, we'll be visiting one of Scotland's most popular preserved lines, the Strathspey Railway. The East Coast Main Line is now the principal intercity route into Scotland. Almost every hour, Class 91 hauled trains provide a fast and efficient service between London, King's Cross and Edinburgh, while trains running further north to Aberdeen are worked by Intercity 125s to avoid the inconvenience of a locomotive change. In the 70s, downgrading or even closure of this stretch was being talked of, but now with the benefit of modernisation, its future seems to be secure. The main freight customer between Berwick and Edinburgh is Blue Circle Cement at Oxwell Mains. The work produces a daily trainload of cement for View Park near Glasgow, plus regular traffic for Aberdeen. Through freight workings on the East Coast route include rover cars for distribution at Bathgate,